Good morning, class. This is Dr. Bryson for the Introduction to Criminal Justice class. In this video, we're going to look at some of the things that happened in the history of the U.S. beginning back in the 1950s that I believe contributed to the rise of the prison population in the United States. So we're going to trace some of these things, and these are my ideas. Others may disagree. The general gist of this video is pretty well agreed upon by most, but I'm going to add a few other things that I think are also important. Some folks do not add the deinstitutionalization movement, but we're going to talk about that. So without further ado, let's talk about deinstitutionalization that really gained its strongest momentum in the 1950s and 1960s that led to several pieces of legislation, including the Community Mental Health Act, that created all of the community mental health centers that we see around the country right now. It's important to understand those came about because of the deinstitutionalization movement. Prior to that, in fact, close to Glenville is the asylum in Weston. There are old psych hospital buildings that are not being used anymore for their original purpose that have been turned into different things, museums or haunted houses, all sorts of different things. Leading up into the 1950s and 1960s, people got into psych hospitals through a lot of different things. There is an old short story from the 1800s by Catherine Gilman Perkins called The Yellow Wallpaper. And that story suggests that a woman who wanted to be a strong, independent woman might have been understood as being mentally ill. People that had mild depression might have been, but maybe a little odd in their demeanor, might have been stuck in a psych hospital. And once someone got into a psych hospital, they tended to stay there for a long time, if not forever. There was a movie that came out called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was based on a novel. But at the same time, Erwin Goffman published a book called Asylums, where he talked about psych hospitals as, quote, being total institutions, meaning that the individuals that live in them, their total life, everything is regimented for them in these institutions. As we became more aware of the need to be more humanitarian in treatments, our treatments became better as they became more humanitarian, but we also realized that we shouldn't be institutionalizing people so much. So all of these laws were passed that made it harder to institutionalize people for the long term. And that came to fruition in the mid-1960s. Now, with that deinstitutionalization was the creation of the community mental health centers. The purpose of those community mental health centers were to make sure that the chronically mentally ill, and these are people that had diagnoses like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, a disorder called schizoaffective disorder, some of these major mental illnesses that we knew were going to have to take medications for the rest of their lives. The community mental health centers were out there to make sure that their treatment needs in the community were there being met. Well, from the mid-60s to the early 1980s, across the country, the community mental health centers were established, and there are new ones that spring up in different places now, but for the most part, every, quote, catchment area or every geographic area in the US had a mental health center available for its citizens. Well, originally, those community mental health centers were funded by the state and by Medicaid. And they didn't have a lot of money, but that wasn't the idea behind them. It was to make sure that that these mentally ill individuals could stay in the community. They could be maintained in the community. Well, the mental health centers were somewhat effective in their job originally, but they started looking at, well, we need funding. We need to make more money. So, oh, you know something? There's a grant that we can get over here for this quote demonstration project if we work with juveniles who have a family member who's mentally ill, or we've got this grant over here, that grant over there. So the mental health centers became all things to all people almost. I mean, that's my way of saying it, but they expanded so much that the original purpose of keeping these chronically mentally ill individuals in the community and maintained went by the wayside in a lot of ways. Well, also during the 1960s and 1970s, with the case of Henry Galt and some other court decisions in the 1960s, juveniles were given due process. Well, folks who then started looking around and saying, oh, well, if they need due process, then we'll give them due process. And they started transferring them to adult courts more and more. So juveniles were treated more like adults in the juvenile court system beginning in the 1970s. Harsh punishments were expanded. It's important for juveniles. It's important to keep that in mind as well. So juveniles, because of the transfer to adult court, could then be kept beyond their 21st birthday. And that waiver to adult court was happening more frequently than was intended. We also need to be aware of the war on drugs in the 1950s, that began in the 1950s, somewhat with the beatniks and the reefer heads, and then went on into the 1990s. The war on drugs was very much like the war on alcohol that was created by the Volstead Act, when the U.S. Constitution was amended to outlaw the sale and possession of alcohol in the U.S. Well, when the Depression hit, they realized, well, we can't really keep up with this too much. But the interesting thing is that during Prohibition, there are a lot of historians that believe that Prohibition actually gave organized crime more of a venue, so that it's a much worse problem now than it would have been had it not been for Prohibition. And many folks think the same thing about the war on drugs. This isn't to say that drugs are not bad for people. It's simply to say that the way we were trying to respond to the problem became more of a problem than the drugs themselves. In the 1980s, we had the hunt for sexual predators. In fact, there's a movie called Witch Hunt about the Kern County, California case, where all of those defendants were later exonerated. Back in those days, they talked about the satanic panic and all sorts of things that people believed were happening that weren't really happening. In the 1990s, there arose the popularity of the idea of the super predator. So notice Yummy, the Southside Shorty. He was on the cover of Time magazine. I believe this was 1992 or 1993, because he killed a little girl in Chicago. He was, I think, 11 years old at the time. He was too young to be charged as an adult. So even with the seriousness of his crime, he was not going to do very much time at all. But they called them shorties, and he was from the south side of Chicago. They called them shorties because these are the kids that the gangs would use to do some of this dirty work, because they knew that those kids would do very short time. Well, the little girl that he killed was not his intended target, but the intended target was not given to him by the gang itself. And they realized that he was a bully and he was operating on his own, and they actually executed him. So that's why he showed up on the cover of Time magazine. So we have all this happening that leads us to the Get Tough on Crime movement. We're going to get tough on crime. And so we're going to incarcerate more and more people. We're going to incarcerate them for drugs. We're going to incarcerate them because they're going to be a super predator if we don't. We've got to protect the public for them. And let's also not forget all of those mentally ill people with the deinstitutionalization movement. They're now out on the street. They're not getting the treatment that they need from the community mental health centers because they're busy doing all these other things to fund themselves. So these chronic mentally ill people are on the streets and they're creating a nuisance. And the police don't like to arrest them and put them in jail, but they don't really have any other options because the deinstitutionalization movement makes it next to impossible to get these individuals into psychiatric hospitals. So our jails and prisons have become de facto psychiatric hospitals. There are a lot of folks that are there that would be better served in a hospital. So in a nutshell, we got mentally ill folks on the street creating a nuisance, and the only way that the police have to get them off the streets is through criminal charges when they need a hospital. We've got the war on drugs. We've got the get harsh on juveniles. So we've got all of these movements. Oh, and let's not forget school shootings and zero tolerance policies that were part of the get tough on crime, and let's give juveniles harsher punishments. All of that plays together, and that increases the prison population and the jail population here in the US. Those are some of the reasons, not the only reasons, but those are some of the reasons why we have such a high prison population here in the US. We'll see you next video.